Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here to introduce a really exciting panel this afternoon on blockchain for the public good. I'm Camille Crittenden. I am Executive Director of CITRIS and the Banatao Institute, and we are here for the 12th year of the CITRIS Research Exchange seminar series. This is hosted every Wednesday afternoon. In other times would be hosted on the Berkeley campus in Sutartadai Hall, but we welcome everyone here to Zoom land and very happy that you can join us. We have a great lineup for the whole Research Exchange series, and I encourage you to look at the links to register. Here are some additional events that are coming up in the next 2 weeks. Especially the one next week coming up in the Research Exchange, Wednesday, November 4th, a discussion on scientific natural language processing and the fight against COVID-19 with Oren Etzioni, who's Chief Executive Officer at the Allen Institute for AI. So you'll see a link there to find out more information. And also in the chat, we welcome you to take a look and see the couple of events coming up. We will be highlighting the schedule for the spring pretty soon as well. Additionally, we every year have an annual call for nominations for the Women in Tech Initiative at UC, the Athena Awards. These awards are meant to recognize those who embody, encourage, and promote the inclusion of women in technology. And we're excited to see the nominations for leaders who inspire others to pursue and persist in technical careers by way of their outstanding contributions and service and mentorship to foster inclusion in science and technical fields. So please take a look at that link and get your nominations in by the end of next week. We really hope to see some great nominations there that we can choose from. And then those will be awarded and presented at the Women in Tech Symposium, which will be held in March 2021. So just a few guidelines about the event this afternoon here on Zoom. Please post any questions that you have in the Q&A box and we'll take a look at those. Our three panelists will pause between their presentations to answer any quick questions that you might have, and then we'll have time at the end as well for Q&A. We're really excited. I am honored and grateful to have the participation from my three co-participants in the California Blockchain Working Group. We got to know each other over the course of the last year as we were working together to create guidelines and recommendations for the state of California regarding blockchain technology. So before I introduce them individually, I'd like to take just a few minutes to give a quick introduction about the blockchain working group itself and the work that we did together there. So this is just an introduction for the panel that you're about to hear on blockchain for the public good. Here's some of the background. There was legislation that was sponsored actually in 2018 to create a blockchain working group through this Assembly Bill 2658 by Assemblymember Ian Calderon. And there were three charges that we had as part of this legislation. One is to define the term blockchain. Of course, there are many definitions of blockchain, but we were charged with finding one that would be workable for the legislative context. So one that wasn't super technical, but one that would be understandable and usable, that could be put in place with some emendations into the regulations that were either existing or about to come about. Second, we were encouraged to evaluate the blockchain uses and its risks and benefits actually for agencies within California, as well as for businesses that might be headquartered here. And then to make specific recommendations to the legislature about any state statutes that might be affected by deployment of blockchain and how those might need to be revised or amended. So the legislation set out specifically that it should be a 20-person working group and had named some specific sectors that were meant to be represented there. So we had the two legislative representatives, Assemblymember Ian Calderon and Senator Robert Hertzberg. We had the next three folks who are listed here, who are my esteemed panelists today, as well as just a short selection of a few other folks who were on the working group with us. And it was a really wonderful group. We had people from the private sector, from public sector agencies, people who were involved in tax and regulation around blockchain, as well as representatives from a number of the agencies. So the IT staff and CIOs of various California agencies that could be affected by some of the recommendations that we were discussing. So here was the process. We had a set of assessment interviews, and we worked with a facilitator actually from Sac State who really helped to make things run smoothly. And she interviewed each of the working group members individually to make sure that we had an understanding of their viewpoints and potential contributions. We met as a full working group about 5 times over the course of the year. And we also had a variety of subcommittees. So we had a finance subcommittee, a regulatory subcommittee that also met intermittently. Because we were a public agent or a public group, we invited public comment, and we did this in a couple of ways. Of course, the meetings themselves were open to the public, and we had really robust discussion actually from people who attended both in person and online. And we also had a survey available on the Government Operations Agency website, where we were able to collect additional input from the public. We also conducted a survey with California IT staff to make sure that we were addressing their concerns as well, to understand their perspectives on readiness potentially for blockchain implementation within their agencies and what some of the obstacles they identified within their organizations. So here are a few of the areas that were studied, and I know that the link to the full report is in the chat or will be soon, but these are some of the areas that we looked at within the scope of the blockchain working group. And we'll address some of those today, but if there are ones that are of particular interest, I encourage you to take a look at those specific areas of the report. So that's what I wanted to say just about the blockchain working group and the report itself overall. I'll turn now and introduce our panelists that I'm really delighted to have join us today. And as I said, please, if you have questions after each of their presentations, go ahead and put those in the chat, and otherwise we'll have some time at the end of the hour to have some discussion. So Brian Behlendorf is Executive Director of Hyperledger, an open source collaborative software development initiative hosted by the Linux Foundation. Brian has a long career in open technology and its application to society, from co-founding the Apache Web Server project in 1995 to working in the White House in 2009 and 2010 to serving as the CTO for the World Economic Forum from 2011 to 2012 and founding a number of companies in the 90s and 2000s. Brian is on the board of directors at the Mozilla Foundation and Electronic Frontier Foundation and is an advisor to ID 2020. So Brian will be the first to make remarks in just a moment. Brian, why don't you go ahead, and then I'll introduce Michele and Ben before their remarks.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Camille. And I really appreciate being invited to participate in this panel and talk with you all. Wanted to just try to set a bit of a framing for what blockchain technology is and why it's actually of interest to all of us, beyond the cryptocurrency hype and beyond kind of the speculative financial kind of bubble, you know, that these things have come and gone in different ways of. And one way to help crystallize it is to perhaps focus on the definition that we arrived at in the working group for what is blockchain. What does it mean? And we, as Camille mentioned, you know, spent a lot of time and effort on kind of honing that down into something that was actually meaningful and actionable for the state, just in case you would see a bill that would specify a blockchain-based solution to some sort of requirement, or a regulatory process that would use the word blockchain. It was important to have a definition that was meaningful enough that it would stand up, you know, if ever tested in a situation like that, and couldn't just be debased to mean, you know, a centralized database sitting somewhere that somebody just slapped the word blockchain on and said ta-da, right? So here, let me read you the definition. You can find it in the report, but I think it might help set the basis for it. It says, blockchain is a domain of technology used to build decentralized systems that increase the verifiability of data shared amongst a group of participants that may not necessarily have a pre-existing trust relationship. Now, this is 2 paragraphs. I'll start, just on that first, some commentary. This was a very delicately honed kind of phrasing to try to make it clear. This is about balancing a set of interests. This is about the verifiability of that data. This is about coming to a converging on a common single system of truth, single system of record, and in a way that I really emphasizes the word decentralized. Of course, decentralization is a spectrum, not a binary kind of thing. So I'll get into that in a bit. Let me read the second paragraph of the definition. Any such system must include one or more distributed ledgers, specialized data stores that provide a mathematically verifiable ordering of transactions recorded in that data store. So really it's about this and then this and then this and then this. It may also include smart contracts that allow participants to automate pre-agreed business processes. These smart contracts are implemented by embedding software in transactions recorded in the data store. So again, we got a little nerdy there. I think we avoided mentioning any specific vendor or specific technology or approach to it, and we're pretty encompassing, but really trying to lay some table stakes. This has to be about something that's mathematically verifiable, meaning this entry and then this entry and then this entry is something we've all witnessed and all agree to as a community. It also really did speak to the automation potential through the use of smart contracts. In many cases, a ledger is going to be enough to be able to create some value. But in most of the interesting use cases we've seen out there in industry, being able to automate that really is key to not only automating certain business processes, but countering or mitigating what's called counterparty risk, where if I sign an agreement, I'm going to pay a mortgage or have an insurance contract, we can write a smart contract that automatically releases those funds if certain conditions are met, rather than hoping that the other side of that agreement keeps their word about when they release those funds. And this is super critical. So let me just back up and ask, why is this different than distributed databases, than what's been built before? Certainly the internet started as a peer-to-peer network, and there have been previous peer-to-peer technologies in the past. And in fact, there have been degrees of decentralization that have been really, really fascinating in these earlier technologies. The internet grew very quickly, even though all we needed to agree upon was a common standard for how TCP/IP packets work, and then a common way to assign IP addresses and eventually domain names to be able to send those packets on their way, right? And that still required having somebody like an ICANN act as the kind of convener for that network and kind of as the root of that name service, right? And in the case of BitTorrent, for example, there's a tremendous amount of decentralization going on when you're sharing files on the BitTorrent network, but there's still these things called trackers. There's still points of centralization that are easy to take down, and we've seen that for copyright enforcement purposes and that sort of thing. But with open source software, for example, we've discovered ways to have kind of these facilitating and centralizing organizations with the ability to, if the centralizing org ever fails, be able to carry that work on elsewhere. And this is, I'm shifting a bit to talk about software development, but this is key here. Open source licenses give us the ability to, say, hey, if the Apache Software Foundation doesn't keep up and serve as a useful coordinating agency for the development of the Apache web server, the license gives us the right as users of that software to go and start a new initiative elsewhere, this right to fork. And blockchain networks, that's what's key. That's what's different here, is even when there's some degree of centralization, the ability for whether it's somebody like in the Ethereum environment, you've got the Ethereum Foundation, who kind of acts as a shepherd or a steward for the Ethereum network, or different standards bodies emerging in this place, or even permission blockchain networks, where you've got somebody permissioning participation on that network based on who can run nodes and that sort of thing. Everybody gets a copy of the data set. Everybody is able to independently verify that history of transactions. And should that central actor no longer serve the interests of the membership, that membership can essentially vote and decide to move on. And this is something that has been theorized in the past. There's the idea around the consensus mechanisms and those Byzantine fault tolerant kinds of things. Those have come and gone in the past in demonstration purposes. But to the credit of Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever she is, Bitcoin was the first to demonstrate that kind of thing could be built at scale. And since that invention, we've been figuring out how can we take these things now that we know that they work, and apply them to these other domains. And do we need a cryptocurrency to fund those kinds of networks, to build these kinds of things or not? That's been an interesting question, and in many cases we found that you can build these kinds of networks without requiring that. So what is this good for? And we'll hear lots of examples. You'll see lots of examples in the report and hear about them for the rest of today. But being able to converge on that single source of truth is important for nearly every business or regulatory process, especially those that cross borders, right? So let me give the oft-cited example of traceable supply chains. And to use one example, the diamond supply chain, which is governed by this international agreement between participants in the diamond trade called the Kimberley process. The Kimberley process is about being able to establish that this diamond that I'm buying at Zales or some other jeweler, actually you can trace the provenance of that back to a mine that has been certified as not employing slave labor, of meeting whatever other requirements that are agreed to as part of that process. Today, that process is a paper-based mechanism of stamps, of attempts to try to verify that this diamond I'm looking at is the same diamond that was pulled out of the ground when that stamp was applied to that paperwork. And it's a very manual process. And it's not just that it's hard to digitize those processes. The question is, who gets to run, if you digitize it, who gets to run the database that everyone feeds into and reads from in such a system, right? It's a very politicized question. And this is politicized not only because these diamonds typically come from countries where, let's just say the rule of law is still an emerging topic. They pass through many other countries where corruption is not a stamped out kind of process. I'll even include the United States as perhaps on that list. And so where that database sits suddenly becomes a very hot topic politically, right? And by using a decentralized network, a distributed ledger, by using a blockchain, we're able to all write into a common pool and know that those rights, those basically attestations, can carry forward and not be modified, not be corrupted, not be disappeared, right? And that this diamond that I'm buying can be cryptographically associated with all those earlier attestations, and in a way that'd be impossible or at least very hard for any one actor to forge or remove that evidence of. So this is all really critical, and this is where this technology is uniquely suited. And it's not just for diamonds. It could be for traceability of rice. There are projects out there to do that. Traceability of fish. And with fish and with diamonds, that tie to the regulatory process is really key, because parties being able to see, are the flow of these fish, for example, there's a lot of regulations out there around fishing quotas that drive not only lawmaking, but also sanctions and all sorts of heavyweight types of activities where the integrity of that data is critical, right? The unassailability of that. Now, what gets written to a blockchain doesn't mean that it's necessarily the truth. Sheila Warren, who is also on the panel, has this great saying, which is computing has a garbage in, garbage out problem, but blockchains have a garbage in, garbage forever problem. So we always have to be kind of on guard for that. But at the very least, it's about rooting those attestations in the claims made by the organizations and the ability to see the complete record of that. So really, this is about how do we introduce trust, especially at a time when trust in institutions is on the decline. Trust in technology, let's all be honest, is also on the decline. These don't replace the need for banks or governments or regulators or that sort of thing, but hopefully it gives us a better basis for working together on those kinds of things than parking all of our data at a single data store at Amazon, Google, eBay, Uber. Pick your enemy, pick your bad guy. It gives us a better basis for being able to build a society that hopefully is more just and auditable.
Thank you, Brian. That was a really wonderful overview. I knew you would be able to give us a good landscape of blockchain and how we got to where we are and what some optimal uses for it might be. So I'm excited to turn now to Michele Benedetto Neitz, who is a professor of law at Golden Gate University School of Law, where she teaches blockchain and the law, legal ethics, business associations, and other classes. She's been voted most outstanding professor by the graduating class of GGU Law 5 times, and most recently just in this past year in 2020. Professor Neitz researches and writes at the intersection of ethics and technology and published the first law review article examining ethics in blockchain technology in January just this year. She recently published at the FinReg blog with an article entitled Ethical Considerations of Blockchain. Do we need a blockchain code of conduct? So welcome, Michele, and take it away.
Well, thanks so much, Camille, and thanks to the CITRIS Research Exchange for setting this panel up. So I do have some slides that I know Ravneet's going to put up for me. Great. So I really appreciate what Brian was saying about the promise of blockchain technology, because the promise of what this technology can do is pretty extraordinary. My focus is on the struggle of law to keep up with the technology, which has been a problem with all types of technology for a very long time. It began with the railroads, right? So there's a lot of confusion. I'm just going to kind of summarize the climate in which the blockchain working group was operating. The federal government has not yet figured out how it wants to regulate blockchain and cryptocurrencies. And there's even confusion around the definition, which is why Brian's point about trying to find a workable definition was actually more challenging than one would expect. The IRS views cryptocurrency as property. The SEC views cryptocurrency as securities. The CFTC considers cryptocurrency to be a commodity. And so operating in this legal landscape can be very difficult. I think that I'm not going to go through all the different types of, or all the different legislative efforts that have been proposed even this year in 2020. There's no shortage of federal lawmakers trying to remedy this problem. But I think that the most telling thing here is the title of the most recent introductory statute, which is the Securities Clarity Act. And frankly, I think that says it all, right? That they even have to introduce the word clarity into the title of a proposed statute tells you what a mess this federal landscape is. This is having a real impact on the industry. Most recently, you have probably heard that Ripple is considering relocating. There are various countries being thrown out there as potential relocation opportunities for Ripple. And Ripple CEO explained that the quote here I have on the slide, the common denominator between all of them is that their governments have created a clarity about how they would regulate different digital assets, different cryptocurrencies. So in the absence of a clear regulatory framework from the federal government, states have been left to create their own strategies. And states are rising to this challenge, most notably states like Wyoming, very small state, very nimble state, able to really jump ahead and do really cutting edge things. California had to lead in a different way because we are not a small state. We have a lot of stakeholders who are affected by blockchain technology. And so our blockchain working group did things differently than some other states. And I think it's most notable in the field of ethics, which will take me to the next slide. So I said this in our meeting, and I will keep saying this everywhere I go. Kudos to California. We were the first, so far we are the only state that has considered ethical issues at the early stage of blockchain regulation. And we actually created a framework in the Blockchain Working Group report for considering ethical issues that relate to the social impact of this technology. The framework focused on things like addressing key ethical design goals. You know, what is the societal benefit? Let's try to maximize the good and minimize the bad. Equity is a huge issue. How will this affect Californians? Will it affect all Californians? Will it affect only a few Californians? Will it have a disproportionate effect based on the wealth status of residents in California? Issues like that really should be considered. And we also have to think about the balance between protecting Californians and encouraging innovation. And this is where arguably the federal lack of clarity is falling down, that we are not encouraging innovation. In fact, we're encouraging companies to leave because we cannot get a federal framework together. The second part of our framework was to consider the use cases related to blockchain technology. So when you're considering the uses, you could think about fairness. Can this technology be deployed in a fair and non-discriminatory way? Accessibility, let's try to design, I know there's a lot of UI research going on out there, but let's try to design to include the most vulnerable user, and to anticipate responsibly what the possible uses of this technology could be, whether those are criminal uses or non-criminal uses of the technology. And lastly, to think about sustainability. You know, this idea that we could use technology to advance public health, something that of course is getting a lot of attention in 2020. Corporate social responsibility could be advanced perhaps through blockchain technology. Sustainability could be advanced through blockchain technology, issues like that. And then the last part of our framework related to minimizing unintended consequences. What are the unintended biases that might happen when we deploy this technology? There's been a lot of attention paid to biases and conflicts in AI. Those concerns are also prevalent in blockchain technology, and so they need to be getting attention. Are there any populations who are being unintentionally harmed by the way this technology is being deployed, or by the way it's developing? And of course, as a lawyer, I have to say, will this technology violate laws? Will it violate federal laws, state laws? Let's think about that in advance. It's really hard to do in the absence of clear laws, but it is something that's worth considering in terms of, even as we're talking about ethics, how can we design technology that won't promote violations of the law? So why are these issues important? Well, for the state, it's actually really important, and I'll give you a couple of examples. So let's say that, and we discussed this actually in the blockchain working group, let's say that we want to create a certification process for blockchain developers who are hired by the state of California. We had a lot of back and forth about creating this type of process. But the problem is that creating that process might actually limit approval to developers who have elite credentials, right? So maybe you have to come out of a top school in order to have access to one of these credentials. Obviously, that raises a lot of equity concerns because this industry needs to be working toward more diversity in terms of gender and cultural backgrounds and the perspectives of industry participants. A second way this could be important is just in the context of if we decide, as California really has, that sustainability is a goal of ours, maybe those who advance environmentally sustainable blockchain development could receive tax credits from the state. Right? So if we've identified this as a goal, there's ways to craft policy that will enable us to reach that goal in a more direct way. Okay, so we're not the only ones talking about ethics. The World Economic Forum, led by our friend Sheila Warren, who is a member of this group, has created the Presidio Principles for organizations to sign on to. The Beek Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown has created a blockchain ethical design framework. And so there needs to be more discussion about this, but I think having a state like California lead the way in our report is a really big step. The second issue I was going to talk about today, I just couldn't help myself because it's part of the working group and we're 6 days away from the election, is to talk about civic engagement with a focus on voting. So we considered the implementation of a blockchain-based voting system. However, these systems have not been shown to be any better at achieving the goals of voting, right? Which is authentication and authorization, making sure you are who you say you are, making sure you're eligible to vote, auditability of elections, anonymity is obviously a critical part of this. Failure reduction, trying to increase participation in elections. These are all really important goals related to voting systems. And the problem is that blockchain systems eliminate some points of failure here, but they also introduce other points of failure. So this led to all sorts of questions. You know, some of the leading blockchain voting systems right now are run by companies that are not open source, which raises transparency concerns, right? Confidence in the results could be undermined because we don't exactly know what's going on with these. A single person could steal thousands of private keys and introduce malware to the system that would affect thousands of votes, and we may not even know that it happened. It's certainly true that thousands of votes could be affected if you burn a ballot box, as has happened already, right, in Boston, or if you intimidate people at the polls. But that's on a smaller scale, and that's certainly more obvious than something like a piece of malware would be. So the computer scientists that the blockchain working group spoke with agreed that right now security is too big of a problem, that we don't have technology yet that is mature enough or secure enough to be deployed at scale in an election. And so we decided not to move forward with that recommendation as part of the blockchain working group report. But somebody else was moving forward at the same time. And so I'll move it to the next slide to show you who might be stealing the show on this, which is surprisingly the cutting edge US Postal Service. Not known for its innovation, right, usually, but actually they have been viewed, I have a direct quote here from somebody who said, they are the only trusted national agency right now that would be capable of managing non-in-person voting at scale, because frankly, they're the only ones that are doing it right now. And so they filed a patent in September to develop and implement blockchain technology on voting systems. The patent claims that the combination here of the security of the blockchain and the mail service would provide a reliable voting system. The registered voter would receive a QR code by mail. Then there would be a separation of voter identification and votes to make sure that we still have voter anonymity. The votes would then be stored on a blockchain attested by elections officials. And so we'll see what happens. I have lots of questions in my head, as many of you may as well, as to the viability of this, and I'm not sure all of the security concerns that folks have around blockchain-based voting systems would be able to be remedied here, but it's exciting to see that folks are trying to move forward with it. We'll see what happens. Obviously too late to do this for November 3rd, right? But it's worth keeping an eye on as we move forward, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with election results, of course, on November 3rd. And with that, I welcome any questions.
Great, thank you, Michele. And that is a great segue actually to Ben. And I'm delighted to have Ben join us today, an elected official. He lives in the nexus of government, law, and technology. He's a member of the Berkeley City Council here in Berkeley, and is a partner at Tackett, Bartlett, LLP. He's working to integrate government and blockchain through regulatory transformation and private enterprise. And Ben had a lot of really great, insightful, innovative ideas as we were discussing the various topics in the blockchain working group. And so I would love for him to share some of those with us now.
Oh, thank you, Camille. And it's good to see Brian and Michele again. It was a great working group. I loved working with you guys. It was really wonderful. We had some good ideas. And I focused on the elements around money because I've seen that when blockchain is applied to money, there's a certain alchemy that occurs, and you can create gold from lead. If you go back to the very beginning, when this is the technology came out of the Great Recession, where they want an alternative money system because capital had stalled. What velocity of money, which is amount of times money moves through the economy, had slowed dramatically. So people came up with their own way to do it. And as a result, for the first time, if you look at the map of people that are getting venture capital funds, the people receiving money from ICOs and things was all over the world, not concentrated in the West Stanford area, Bay Area. So it was really cool. I was really excited about the democratization and potential wealth generating for low-income people, and also as a course correction for the internet itself, because the internet, is in many regards, I feel, has not lived up to its promise of creating an egalitarian life. It's helping feed the concentration of wealth and power. So we want to spread it around. And so honing in on the money parts in our report, I was really excited to work on these things with all of you. So one, we dug into the role of a state coin. We nicknamed it CalCoin. A lot of fun. And the idea being that when you're distributing resources like welfare or benefits or unemployment benefits or this coronavirus pandemic aid under the CARES Act, the existing systems are slow and rife with lots of fees and fraud, and the delays are insane. And so one way to do it would be to just issue a digital wallet and just deposit the money immediately with very little cost at all. And then you could even address issues around the fraud, lots of fraud. There's someone in the news yesterday, I read they're going to go to jail because they somehow were able to make enough fake EDD accounts to get $1 million. And you know, then they did a rap song about it, so it got out. They're in trouble. But it highlights the issue of fraud that is hurting the process. And also, you go a step further. You know, you could, if you have these underbanked people, and that's pretty much the focus of the works we did in Money here, was helping the underbanked, the unbanked, the poor, right? Because these people are paying lots of fees, they have the bank accounts, they're receiving benefits, and they're spending. So the CalCoin mechanism was really exciting, and you know, that's something that I know people are looking at right now. A bank was talking about it just last month because of the new rule change. Said that certain chartered banks under the OCC can hold crypto as a deposit. And that's really exciting. So they're looking at possibly doing something like this because they're already in the business of distributing these benefits, right? So that's exciting. And then we looked at bonds and public finance. And this is built off, you know, a concept we had here in Berkeley around the microbonds, which are the same way. The technology allows you to issue a bond for very little cost and keep track of the ownership really easily, and then program, automate, if you will, payments, payment flows, payment structures, you know, trading and moving of the instruments, and all that streamlined cost, all that streamlined technology allows you to offer bonds for very cheap, so that ordinary people can buy into capital markets, right? So imagine a bond costing $2, $3. So we wrote about that and all the streamlining that could occur with the technology, and we looked at some places around the world that are doing their versions of it, and we're going to be tracking the Berkeley project that'll go forward as soon as we get our head underwater from this pandemic. You know, it's still going forward. So that was exciting, and that is still exciting because, you know, these are all mechanisms to get more money into investment systems and generate returns, and it can be deployed for you name it, you know, environmental issues, you know, infrastructure for electric vehicles and solar and affordable housing, and you know, the new infrastructure can be crowdsourced via these mechanisms. You know, public banking, well, we talked about that too, and that was a big one. California has recently enabled the creation of, I think, 10 public banks, 2 a year for 5 years. I think that's the number. And it's really neat because it's wide open. You can do whatever you want to do with them. And, you know, so I think the state is waiting for applications. And so one such application that we explored was sort of mimicking what's happening in the DeFi space. And of course, you know, if we're talking about money, we got to talk about DeFi because that blew up right after we finished the report. This whole smart contract pooled asset universe of decentralized finance, which is like a proving ground for all the things we're talking about. They're doing all these interesting little products and mechanisms for people who are crypto fanatics. And there at this point, there's $11 billion locked up in smart contracts right now. So it's happening already in the unregulated left-hand universe. And so we're hoping to, you know, with these legislative outlines and explorations to provide a framework for it to migrate into the normal world where unbanked people who aren't sophisticated can participate in what's happening. So the public banking that we explored was, you know, creating a decentralized sort of statewide digital bank for the unbanked to maybe have remittances or hold their money and gather interest payments and receive benefits. And we found a really cool nonprofit here in the Bay Area that's really halfway there. They had a Bitcoin ATM in their place, and they're exploring how do you get the unbanked to give and receive funds remotely via this technology. So one of our recommendations was that somebody make a public bank and partner with this nonprofit to replicate what they're doing on a much larger level. And I remember we talked about the vision of the low-income farm worker in the Central Valley being part of the bank, as well as the office cleaning lady who lives in Antioch and works in San Francisco, and the unemployed senior citizen receiving benefits. All of them in this digital public bank. So there's a lot of overlap. Yeah. So I think those are the main areas that we covered. But the concept is really that the evolution of the technology to drive a need, and the need is capital. The need is ordinary people and capital velocity to come together. And I think the technology is moving that way. And our work here highlighted some potential areas that the government could meet it halfway and embrace it. And you see this in the Marshall Islands right now. They've just finished their own state currency. It's for internal use, but it will be out in the market at some point. And the Marshall Islands is sinking, right? The island is sinking under the water, and there's a new poverty taking hold. So they did this to finance remediating their island damage. So that's an example we're talking about, but on a macro scale, where a nation state embraces crypto to save itself. And so if a nation state can do it, then so can families.
Thank you, Ben. Those are great examples, which I knew you would bring to the table. I'm really glad to have you all here. So we have a couple of questions in the chat, and I'll invite the panelists to turn on their mics and to jump in to help us answer some of these questions, and then we might have questions for each other as well. So one is going back to Brian's presentation and the comments about phishing. With regard to the phishing discussion, how would law enforcement entities such as the U.S. Coast Guard access a given blockchain to enter phishing violations, such as high seas drift netters and their potential correlation around legal catches and not. So I think more broad, that's a very good specific question if you want to reply to that, but also more broadly, how does blockchain work in improving supply chain reliability, especially when there's perhaps this disconnect between the digital record and the actual thing, whether it's a fish or a diamond or whatever the example might be. I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Sure, I'll give a take, and happy to have other panelists weigh in as well. I think it's important not to lead with the technology, but lead with the regulatory or community process that calls out for a need for that. So for an example, in a regulatory process around fisheries, start with, who are the organizations that are setting international quotas for that regulate the fishing industry, right? Who are the enforcement agencies involved in that? Who are the private sector players? And the same governance mechanisms that they use to set those quotas and regulate that industry will typically call out for reporting mechanisms, for data gathering mechanisms, for systems to converge on that single source of truth. And once you've got that network of kind of enforcement and governance in place, being able to support it with a blockchain platform is pretty straightforward. I mean, the tooling we've really spent the last 10 years kind of honing and seeing now deployed out there. But I think those questions really speak to those governance processes at the top, rather than to how the technology works. To try to think of another angle to this, there are public blockchains to which some of these things can be written. Those obviously have GDPR issues if what you write is and I'm kind of anticipating another question here, I guess. If what you write has personally identifiable information in it, because one of the hallmarks of these ledgers is you can't change what's been written, in the same way that you can't go and seize up every newspaper that's ever been published in the world that might mention a certain fact in it, right? So good things about that. Yeah, so that's But then there are also permission blockchains, basically databases and ledgers shared amongst a population of organizations. And you can always expand that circle. You can even contract it, right? And there's spectrums between the two, of course. But I think that key question is, how might the Coast Guard participate in that process? First has to start with the use case, and then secondly becomes a technology question, but easy to answer the technology side.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great, very helpful answer. There was a somewhat related question around pharmaceuticals and looking at how pharmaceuticals might be put on a blockchain, or to increase reliability or trust in pharmaceuticals. Is this a potential area of application for blockchain within the pharmaceutical industry? Brian,
I mean, I'll jump in as well. There is actually already quite a bit of water under this bridge. There's something called the Drug Supply Safety and Certification Act, CSA, or however it plays out, that the FDA rolled out about 2 years ago, and specifically called out for pilots that used a distributed ledger as a means to enable clear reporting around the traceability of pharmaceuticals from factory to the prescriber, to the pharmacy. As a health and safety measure for sure, but also now starting to be called into service in this question of how are we going to distribute COVID-19 vaccines next year. Of the 19 different pilots, 5 of them used distributed ledgers, and there's active conversations now about the consortiums that will pull that together for deployment next year. So really exciting application of this thing, of the technology.
Yeah, those are great examples. So going back to the question that you had alluded to, and Michele, maybe I'll ask you about this. How does blockchain intersect with the privacy regulations? So not only GDPR, but we have emerging privacy regulations here in California as well. Since blockchain is a persistent database of information, how does that affect the regulations around the right to delete information or one's personal control over personal data?
That is a great question. The answer is very awkwardly is how these things are going to play out. So the CCPA and the GDPR are the lead privacy statutes at the moment. And so they effectively will likely serve as models if there is a federal privacy statute. I would say that we have not seen blockchain companies fleeing Europe as a result of the GDPR. I think that the reason people might leave California is not because of the CCPA, but it's going to be more about the lack of regulatory clarity that the US has. Specifically, if you want to talk specifically about this right to delete, we have not yet seen how this is going to play out in a legal way. But I can smell the lawyers, right? You can kind of smell litigation coming, because it is likely that if someone's, for example, private information related to voting were to be put on a ledger that is then viewable, even if it's not readable, if it's viewable by, or it's readable, but even if it cannot be accessed to be written upon by the members of the public, if it's viewable by the public, that raises a lot of concerns. And this is one of the risks related to something like blockchain voting, that what if these votes could be somehow, somebody could tinker with the ledger to enable people's votes to become known, and now we've lost anonymity in voting, which is a critical component of our American voting. So the CCPA is still being worked through. It's not a perfect statute. It certainly is, I would argue, a step forward when it comes to privacy, and I think it was really necessary. But specifically how it's going to interplay with blockchain technology use cases, we haven't seen yet. We're still so early in this development of both privacy laws and blockchain technology. So that will be a great one to watch.
Yeah, thank you, indeed. So Ben, there's a question here that you might be able to address around cryptocurrency. And the question is regarding the wealth inequality that is sometimes created by these cryptocurrency markets. Are there ways that you see that cryptocurrency can help to mitigate that? Are there ways that cryptocurrency can be available to a wider variety of people and to have some kind of anti-poverty element to cryptocurrency?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And there are a lot of great minds working on just that. So if you look at the granddaddy of them all, Bitcoin, that's clearly not affordable. It's at what, 13,500 today, I think, something like that, approaching $14,000. Although you can buy fractional shares of it, so maybe that will become accessible. But the real way to get it going is the spirit of creation that engendered is now produced, so many other coins, so many other projects. And I think that the issues will be around scalability, because for the masses to get into it, the ordinary people, it's going to have to be way easier to use. And so, the user interface for this stuff is for the diehard, diehard tech fans, right? But for the ordinary folks to use it, it's got to become easier. And you see that happening now. You have an interface like Coinbase, which is really easy to use. They apparently are able to send coins and money through the phone quite easily using your phone number, like they do in Africa already, right? And China. It's not really, I don't know why we have to reinvent what they're already doing around the world, but you leveraging the phone as an easy way to send and receive and participate in these different, money market creations, these program the money to be borrowed from the DeFi universe, yield creation. But the issue again is going to be the ease of use and the scalability. So you can have 8 million people now using it easily on their phones. But all of these are being worked on, like Brian and his organization. That's the threshold. Did I answer the question? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. And you touched on a question that I had actually for all of you, and that's around workforce development. So we have these amazing markets that are coming open, different opportunities for building out blockchain platforms and all these different application areas. What is your sense of the future of work with regard to blockchain? Are we going to need a whole lot more computer scientists, user interface designers, lawyers to think about the regulatory aspects? Like, where do you see those needs, and how can a university help to fulfill them? Or are there other educational institutions or programs that could help to fulfill those workforce needs? Brian, maybe we'll start with you.
I think the trend in the technology world has definitely been one where it hasn't gotten any simpler. It hasn't. There are not fewer technologies on the landscape today than there were before. So workforce development inevitably becomes more about programming and technology as these, not only blockchain but also artificial intelligence tools become more pervasive and more core to how, even consumer products companies operate, or financial organizations, how much they are shifting from being about managing the flow of, whatever they did before around finances to actually digitizing these processes, right? So, I actually found myself leaning towards the side of saying maybe there should be formal certifications in how to use some of these technologies, even at the risk of creating a little bit of a demarcation, haves and have-nots kind of situation, because there are, especially when it comes to ethics, especially when it comes to building these for the long term, some serious issues that can be introduced by very subtle decisions that are made at the architectural, at the plumbing layer. So it is a full employment act for programmers out there already. We see that blockchain is one of the more highly sought after skills out in the job markets, and I think that'll just continue to rise.
Yeah, thank you. Michele, what do you see in your students, and from your perspective, what are the needs going to be?
It's a great question. So I actually, this is my passion, right? Because I'm an educator. And I taught the first blockchain in the law class in San Francisco last spring at Golden Gate University, because I went to our dean and said, there are jobs for new grads who understand blockchain technology, and we need to start training our workforce in the law to be able to handle issues around regulation. The litigation hasn't even begun around blockchain technology. I mean, it is going to be massive. And so there are going to be entire firms, there already are, but even larger firms dedicated just to trying to advise clients about the regulatory scheme and then litigating when clients run afoul of either with other clients or of the government. So I think there is a responsibility in law schools and among lawyers to understand new technologies, whether that's AI or blockchain. One thing the pandemic has done for lawyers is that it has forced us to be much more tech savvy than we are normally comfortable being. And so in that sense, I think there's going to be more of an openness in the law to really understanding the changes and the promises that technology can bring. My hope is that we can train an entire workforce of attorneys who will be able to work with clients. To Brian's point about certifications, I think I'm really excited at the idea of maybe incorporating community colleges as places that folks could go to get the certification to try to make sure that we are maintaining equity, while I think Brian's point about the subtleties of the architecture are critical. And so that might be one way to achieve both ends of that goal.
Yeah, indeed. And I'll just touch on one aspect that we mentioned in the blockchain working group report was not only the need for training of people who can work in this space, but also thinking about implementing digital credentials for education credentials themselves. So using the blockchain for learners to be able to have a digital wallet for their learning credentials. So it would be more easily and nimbly shared with other folks. Ben, before we close, I wanted to turn the question to you as well, thinking about the workforce, but then also perhaps introducing the idea of entrepreneurship and startups, and how can these groups get involved in blockchain projects as a startup company? What ideas might you have?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have to second what Brian and Michele both said about the computer programming world. Of course, it's full on. But thinking ahead though, in terms of AI becoming more and more sophisticated, and the building blocks of programming language being much more available for ordinary folks to use with AI assistance, that's all on the horizon. So so programming, the young people need to learn, or anyone going back to school, or any kind of user experience training, because that's stuff that robots can't do too well. Not yet, but soon they will be. Through A/B testing, they'll be able to tell which button is better just from running 1,000 tests, right? So you want to have the facility with the technology, but the creative component. So the young people I talk to, I tell them to get really good at one other thing, and typically that thing, because this is entrepreneurial, right? You need to be able to look at an unstable situation and create a pattern there, right? And that is, you learn that doing something else. So this kind of systems thinking, it's hard to really quantify it. It could be studying you could be studying computers and also painting, or computers and also water hydrology, right? Or bricklaying, right? But something from the other world that helps you organize situations into something. And then you'll have a business. You'll create a business if you think that way. You have the tools and the vision. And so for entrepreneurs who are already in the business of entrepreneuring, this is the perfect space for you, because the technology just allows you to get anything going. You could write a good outline and get a good crew together and raise $4 million, right? And get it going. That's what Brian did. I'm kidding. So it's a really optimistic space where you have a lot of spirited fans of the technology who want to do different things. So for an entrepreneur, I would just study all the ways the default world, the normal world we live in, the pre-blockchain world, look at all find a flaw in it that can be addressed via the technology. This report that this body wrote, we touch on every major component. Read it and get inspired, and you can come up with something really good. And you have more and more capital coming your way to support you, whether from the blockchain world or the normal investment world. And also, if you're unable to get out there and raise money from your rich uncles, you can now just get it going yourself. Just get a programmer to work with you. You can start making money and generating return off your idea without the big investment world. It's become democratized. So that's what I say. If you're an entrepreneur, you got to get into it, because that's the growth of the future is going to come from small operators like yourself, and the tools are all there for you to launch it.
Thank you. Well, I think with that shout out for interdisciplinary research and exposure that we'll try to wrap up the panel this afternoon. Any final words you'd like to offer, Brian, Michele, or Ben?
No, I just echo again, read the report. We tried to find a lot of great examples within California, but also outside of California that I hope serve as inspiration for people to think about how this might apply to whatever field that you're in.
I would say the same. I would echo what Brian and Ben are saying. And thanks very much for this opportunity to have a little reunion. It was very fun to see all of you.
Yes, it was great. Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for participating, and thanks to our viewers and listeners. The contact information for all of us is in the chat or otherwise available. So if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out. Thanks and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.